The text came in at 7:12 a.m., while Renee Calloway was standing in her kitchen in scrubs she hadn't changed out of, holding a cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink. Mom, sweetheart, I think it's best if you sit this one out. Paige wants today to be about closeness and we both know that isn't really you. I already told the coordinator you won't be on the list. Renee read it twice. Then a third time because the words weren't rearranging themselves into something that made sense. She had been awake for 19 hours. Her last patient of the overnight shift had been a 61-year-old man in cardiac arrest, and she had done compressions for 6 minutes before the attending called it, and she had gone into the supply closet afterward and allowed herself 90 seconds to cry before washing her face and finishing her charting. She had picked up her dress from the tailor 2 days ago. She had a card in her purse for her sister, and inside the card was a check for $4,000, because the flowers had come in 20% over budget and nobody had said anything to Paige about it, because nobody ever said anything to Paige about money. That was Renee's job. It had been her job for 12 years. She set the coffee down. Her hands were doing something strange. Not shaking exactly but hovering, like they didn't know what task to attach themselves to now that the task of the last decade had just been erased in a single text message. She called her mother. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, which told her everything she needed to know, because her mother never let calls go to voicemail. Diane Calloway answered everything on the first ring, always had, ever since Renee's father died, and answering the phone immediately became one of Diane's particular anxieties, the fear that if she didn't pick up fast enough the next call would be the one that ruined everything. Renee sat down at her kitchen table and looked at the check in the card. $4,000. On top of the $11,000 for the venue deposit. On top of the $21,000 balance she'd wired to Ashgrove Manor herself from her own account 6 weeks ago, because Paige and her fiancé Eric didn't have it and Diane had said, well, someone has to, and it certainly isn't going to be me on a fixed income. In that tone she used that made helping feel like an obligation and refusing feel like a betrayal. Renee had wired the money without telling anyone the account it came from was hers. That had been her choice. She'd wanted her sister to have this day without the specter of who paid for what hovering over it. She had wanted for once to just be an aunt someday, a sister, a person who showed up and cried at the right parts and didn't spend the whole reception doing math in her head. Instead she was sitting at her kitchen table at 7:14 a.m. in yesterday's scrubs, uninvited from the wedding she had paid for. To understand how Renee Calloway arrived at this kitchen table, you have to go back 12 years, to a hospital corridor in February, to her father lying in a bed with tubes in his arms and a look on his face like a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. Renee had been 23 then, a year out of nursing school, still learning the particular exhaustion of 12-hour shifts. Paige had been 16, a junior in high school, the kind of pretty that made teachers overlook late homework and made boys drive an hour out of their way for a chance to say hello. Diane had been 49 and grieving, and Renee would understand only years later, quietly terrified because Renee's father had handled the money, all of it, for 26 years of marriage, and when he died he left behind a mortgage, a modest life insurance policy that mostly covered the funeral, and a wife who had never once balanced a checkbook. Renee remembered the conversation in the hospital cafeteria 3 days after the funeral. Her mother, hollow-eyed, stirring a coffee she wasn't drinking, saying, I don't know what we're going to do about Paige's tuition. Community college doesn't pay for the nice programs. And her braces aren't finished. And Renee, I don't know how to do any of this. Renee had been the responsible one since she was 8 years old. It was simply a fact of her personality, the way some people are tall or left-handed. She had been the one who did the family's taxes online at 19 because her father's handwriting was bad and the forms confused him. She had been the one who, at 23, sitting across a cafeteria table from her devastated mother, said without fully understanding what she was agreeing to, I'll help. We'll figure it out. He had meant 6 months. Maybe a year. Long enough for her mother to find her footing, for Paige to finish high school, for things to stabilize. It became 12 years. She paid off the remainder of Paige's orthodontics. $4,000 she put on a card and paid down for 2 years. She covered the gap between what financial aid didn't touch and what a state university actually cost 3 years running, because her mother kept saying we're so close just this semester, and Renee kept believing her because that was easier than not believing her. She paid the mortgage twice. In years the market was bad and Diane's part-time bookkeeping job wasn't covering the gap. She bought her mother a reliable used car when the old one died on the highway with Diane inside it, because the thought of her mother stranded on an off-ramp at 54 years old made something in Renee's chest go tight in a way she couldn't argue with. And somewhere in the middle of all that, she genuinely could not pinpoint the year, she became, in the language of her own family, the sister who wasn't close. The one who worked too much. The one who missed Sunday dinners because she was pulling a double, and who was talked about at those dinners in a tone of gentle, regretful disappointment, as though her absence were a character flaw and not the direct mechanism by which the mortgage got paid. She learned slowly not to correct the narrative. Correcting it felt petty. It felt like keeping score in a family that was supposed to be beyond scorekeeping. So when Diane told her cousin at Easter that Renee's always been the independent one, never needed much from us, doesn't come around as often as we'd like, Renee sat 2 feet away and said nothing, because saying something would have meant explaining the spreadsheet on her laptop, the one that tracked 11 years of transfers, and explaining the spreadsheet felt like admitting she'd been counting the whole time. She had been counting the whole time. She just hadn't let herself look at the number until this morning. Renee called her sister next. Paige picked up on the second ring, breathless, clearly mid-hair and makeup. "Ren. I can't talk long, Marisol's doing my hair and I look like a wet cat right now." "Paige, did you know Mom took me off the guest list?" Pause. Not a long one, but long enough. Long enough that Renee understood, with a small collapsing feeling, that this was not news to her sister. She said, "Okay," she said, "it would be easier. That you and her have been weird lately and she didn't want any tension today. Ren, please don't do this right now, I have 4 hours. I paid for the venue, Paige. I know you helped and I'm so grateful, I really am, but I didn't help. I wired $21,000 to Ashgrove Manor under my own name 6 weeks ago. The remaining balance. I'm the client of record on that contract. Did you know that?" Another pause, this one heavier. "Mom said she and Eric's parents split it." Renee closed her eyes. There was not just erasure, a substitution. A story rewritten cleanly enough that her own sister, the person she'd driven to school every morning for 2 years so their mother didn't have to take unpaid time off work, believed a different woman had paid for her wedding. "I have to go," Renee said, and hung up before her voice could do the thing it wanted to do. She sat with the check in the card for a long time. She thought about tearing it up. She thought about driving to Ashgrove Manor anyway and sitting in the back row and daring anyone to remove her. She thought about calling in sick to her own life for the day and sleeping until Tuesday. What she actually did was open her laptop, log into her bank's app, and look at the wire confirmation from 6 weeks ago. Callaway, Renee M. Ashgrove Manor Event Services, $21,415. Ref. Callaway/Kessler Wedding final balance. Her name. Her account. Her signature on file with the venue's coordinator, a woman named Breon, who Renee had spoken to on the phone 4 times over the past 2 months to iron out catering headcounts and a lighting upgrade Paige wanted. Renee picked up her phone and called Bree instead of her mother. "Ashgrove Manor, this is Bree." "Hi Bree, it's Renee Callaway. I'm listed as the client of record on the Callaway-Kessler wedding today." "Oh. Hi Renee, of course we're just setting up now, everything's looking beautiful. Is everything okay?" Renee took a breath. "I've actually been removed from the guest list by the family. I wanted to let you know directly, since my name and card are on the contract, in case there's any confusion later about who to reach if there's a billing question." There was a pause on the other end that told Renee Bree understood exactly what kind of situation this was, even without being told the details. Event coordinators, Renee suspected, saw a great deal of family weather up close. Thank you for telling me. That's actually really strange since you're the one I've been coordinating the whole balance with." A beat. "Renee, for what it's worth, I hope you're doing okay. That's a lot." "I'm fine," Renee said, which was not true, and hung up before Bree could ask her anything else. What Renee did not know, what nobody in her family knew because it had never once occurred to any of them to ask her a single question about her actual job beyond the vague, dismissive "she's a nurse, works too much," was that 2 years earlier in the ICU at Meridian General, Renee had spent 11 days keeping a 72-year-old man named Harold Kessler alive after a post-surgical infection nearly killed him. Harold had come in septic, unstable, his kidneys failing, his son sleeping in the family lounge in the same clothes for 4 days straight because he refused to go home. Renee had been his primary night nurse for the worst stretch of it. The stretch where the attending physician had, at 3 a.m. on the 4th night, quietly told the son that they should prepare for the possibility that his father wouldn't make it through the week. Renee remembered that night with the particular clarity that certain nights in an ICU carve into a person. She remembered adjusting Harold's pressors minute by minute. She remembered his son, a tall, exhausted man in his late 20s, standing in the doorway with his hand over his mouth. She remembered talking to Harold anyway, even sedated, even unresponsive, because some part of her believed, still believes, that unconscious people hear more than medicine gives them credit for. She had told him about her own father. She had told him at one point at 4 a.m. with nobody else awake in that wing of the hospital, that she wasn't going to let him die on her shift, and she had meant it with the kind of stubbornness that had gotten her through every difficult thing in her life. Harold Kessler lived. He went home 6 weeks later. Renee moved on to the next patient, the next crisis, the next 12-hour shift, and never thought about the Kessler family again. She did not know that Harold Kessler's son was named Eric. She did not know that Eric Kessler was, at this exact moment, standing in a groom's suite at Ashgrove Manor, adjusting his cufflinks, about to marry Paige Calloway. She did not know that Harold Kessler was going to walk into that same suite in 20 minutes, take one look at the seating chart Bree had left on the table for the family to review, notice a name crossed off in blue ink at the very top of the immediate family section, ask his son who Renee Calloway was, and go very still when Eric told him. Harold found his son by the window. Eric. This name here. Renee Calloway. Crossed off. Who is that? Paige's older sister. Dad, it's a whole thing. I don't really want to get into it right now. We're kind of on a clock. Humor me. Harold's voice had a quality to it his son rarely heard. The voice of a man who had spent 40 years running a construction company and knew when something didn't add up. What does she do? She's a nurse. See, I think. Why? Harold set the seating chart down slowly. What hospital? Meridian General. Dad, what is going on? Harold sat down on the small settee against the wall, and for a moment he looked less like the sharp, solid man his son knew and more like the man who'd been in a hospital bed 2 years ago, thin and yellow and frightened, though he'd never admitted the frightened part to anyone. 2 years ago, Harold said slowly, I had an infection after my hip revision. I was in the ICU for 11 days. There was a night nurse. Talked to me even when I couldn't answer her. I remember, Eric, I remember almost nothing from that week. It's mostly fog, but I remember her voice. I remember her saying she wasn't going to let me die on her shift. Your mother told me her name afterward because I wanted to write a thank you card and never did, because I'm an idiot, and then time passed and I forgot to follow up on it. He looked up. Renee Calloway. Is that a common name? Eric's face had gone slightly pale. Dad. Paige's sister paid for this wedding. All of it. I only found out because I saw the venue contract by accident 3 weeks ago and it had her name and her card on it, not Diane's. I asked Paige about it and she got weird and said her mom would handle it. I let it go because it wasn't my business. He rubbed his jaw. You're telling me the woman who might have kept you alive is the same woman my mother-in-law just erased from the wedding she's paying for. Harold stood up. Get your mother-in-law. Now please. Before the ceremony, not after. Diane Calloway was in the bridal suite adjusting Paige's veil when Bree knocked, apologized for the interruption, and said quietly that Mr. Kessler, the groom's father, needed a word with her urgently before the ceremony. Diane found Harold in the small parlor off the main hall, standing with his arms crossed, looking at her with an expression she would later describe to a friend as like he'd already made up his mind about me before I even opened my mouth. Mrs. Calloway. I understand you removed your daughter Renee from the guest list this morning. Diane's chin lifted, the reflexive defensiveness of a woman used to being the one who explained things to other people, not the one being questioned. That's a family matter, Mr. Kessler, I don't think. I paid for the venue, Harold said, which was not quite accurate. Harold and his wife had contributed toward the rehearsal dinner and nothing more, but he said it deliberately to see what Diane would do with the lie. What Diane did was flinch minutely and then say, no, I mean the venue was, Eric's family covered part of the venue and we. That's not what the contract says. Harold's voice was level, unhurried. The voice of a man who had negotiated construction contracts for 4 decades and had absolutely no patience left for people who fudged numbers in front of him. My son showed me the contract 3 weeks ago. $21,415, wired 6 weeks ago by a woman named Renee Calloway. The same woman you crossed off your guest list this morning. He paused. The same woman who was my ICU nurse 2 years ago. During 11 days I don't remember very well except that I'm alive because of the people in that unit. I'd like someone to explain to me why the person who is, by every practical measure, the reason this wedding is happening at all, is not welcome to sit in a chair and watch it. Diane's face had gone through several colors. It isn't. She doesn't come around, Mr. Kessler. She's never around for the family. We barely see her. Because she's working, Harold said. Because she's the kind of person who spends her holidays keeping strangers' fathers alive so their families get to have moments like this one. He gestured at the room, the flowers, the light coming through the windows. I don't know your family, Mrs. Calloway, and it isn't my business how you raised your daughters. But I know what it costs a hospital to run an ICU overnight, and I know what it costs to run a wedding like this one, and I know that somebody in your family paid for both of those things without asking for a single thank you card, and it apparently wasn't you. Diane sat down slowly in one of the parlor chairs, and for the first time that morning, something in her face cracked open. Not defensiveness this time, but something rawer, closer to shame. I didn't want people to think we needed help, she said very quietly. I didn't want people to think I couldn't take care of my own family. You didn't, Harold said, not unkindly but not gently either. Your daughter did. For a long time it sounds like. And you let everyone believe otherwise, including apparently your other daughter. He nodded toward the door where Paige had appeared, veil half-pinned, having heard enough of the last minute of conversation to go white. Mom, Paige said. Is that true? What followed was not a screaming match. Renee would learn all of this later, secondhand from Bree, and then in more detail from Paige herself over the phone 2 days after the wedding, both of them crying at different points in the conversation. What followed was Paige sitting down across from her mother in a small parlor room with wedding music already beginning to filter faintly through the walls, and asking in a voice that had lost all of its earlier breathlessness, exactly how much money her sister had spent on her over the past 12 years. Diane didn't know the exact figure. Of course she didn't. She had never had to know it because Renee had never made her know it. But Bree, still standing in the doorway, offered the venue total. Harold, still standing by the window, mentioned, because his son had told him, having finally put the pieces together himself over the last 3 weeks. The tuition gap Renee had covered, the braces, the car. Paige sat very still through all of it. She was 28 years old and she was hearing for the first time in 9 minutes before her own wedding, a genuinely accurate account of her own life. She missed my 16th birthday because she was working a double, Paige said slowly, to no one in particular. I was so mad at her. I didn't talk to her for 2 weeks. Mom told me she just didn't prioritize us. She looked up. Was she working that double because of tuition? Nobody answered, which was an answer. Mom. Paige's voice cracked. Did you tell people she wasn't close to the family because it was easier than telling them she was the only reason we still had a house? Diane didn't answer that one either. She was crying now, the particular ugly, unglamorous crying of someone whose careful story about herself has just collapsed in front of witnesses. Paige stood up. She was still in her half-pinned veil, still in her dress, with 11 minutes until the ceremony was supposed to start and a hallway full of guests who had no idea any of this was happening. Get her here, Paige said. Right now. Call her Mom. I don't care what you have to say to convince her. Get my sister here. Renee was sitting on her kitchen floor. She'd moved from the table to the floor at some point without noticing, her back against the cabinets, the check still in her hand, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She was tired in a way that went past the 19 hours awake, tired in the specific bone-deep way of someone who has just watched 12 years of quiet effort get reduced to a single dismissive text message. But something made her pick up. Renee? This is Bree from Ashgrove Manor. I know this is strange, but please don't hang up. Paige wants to talk to you. She's right here. There was a fumbling sound and then Paige's voice, wrecked and urgent. Ren, I know everything. Harold Kessler, Eric's dad, he figured it out. He's the patient you had 2 years ago, the ICU one. Do you remember him? Renee's chest did something complicated. Harold Kessler. Hip infection. 11 days. That's him. He recognized your name on the contract. Ren, I know about the venue. I know about my tuition, the braces, the car, all of it. Moms, she's a mess right now. She's not going to explain it well, but I need you to know that I didn't know. I really didn't know. I thought she told me Eric's parents split the venue with her. I've been telling everyone my whole life that you were just distant. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. Renee closed her eyes. 12 years condensed into 40 seconds of a phone call. Please come, Paige said. Please. I don't want to do this without you. I want you to walk me down the aisle. Both of us, if I know Dad's not, you. I want you there. Not in the back row. I want you standing next to me when I do this. Renee sat on her kitchen floor and cried for the first time all morning. Not the 90-second professional, get it together and finish charting cry of the supply closet, but something bigger, something that had been building for 12 years and had simply never had an opening wide enough to get out through until now. I need 40 minutes, she said finally. I'll hold the ceremony, Paige said. I don't care if we start at noon instead of 11. Just come. Renee arrived at Ashgrove Manor in a navy dress she kept for exactly this kind of last-minute need. A dress that lived in her closet for years just in case, the way she kept most things in her life ready for an emergency that hadn't announced itself yet. Bree met her at the side entrance and walked her through the kitchen hallway rather than the front, not out of secrecy but because it was faster, and Bree had apparently decided somewhere in the last hour that she was fully on Renee's side of whatever this was. Diane was waiting near the bridal suite. She looked smaller than Renee remembered her looking ever in 12 years of watching her mother manage rooms with practiced confidence. Renee. Diane's voice shook. I don't know how to say this in a way that's good enough. I've been telling myself a story for years that made me the one holding this family together, and it wasn't true, and I let everyone believe it wasn't true, including you, especially you, because I think some part of me couldn't stand to admit how much I needed you. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. Renee looked at her mother for a long moment. 12 years is a long time to build a wall, and walls don't come down because of one hallway conversation 90 seconds before a wedding. It's not enough, Renee said honestly. But it's a start. We're going to need to have a much longer conversation than this. Today isn't that day. Today is Paige's. She walked past her mother into the bridal suite, where Paige turned around in her dress, veil finally pinned properly, mascara redone, eyes still red, and simply held her arms open. They stood there for a while not saying much because there wasn't really anything left to say that the last hour hadn't already said for them. You're walking me down, Paige said into her shoulder. Both of us. I already told the officiant. I'm not your father, Renee said. You're the reason I have a father-in-law to be scared of, Paige said, which made them both laugh wetly in the particular way people laugh when they've been crying too hard for too long and need somewhere for the pressure to go. At 11:52 a.m., 42 minutes later than the program had promised, Paige Calloway walked down the aisle at Ashgrove Manor with her sister on one side of her. There was no father to walk her down, he'd been gone 12 years, and there had never really been a plan for that gap until this morning, when it filled itself in without anyone having to ask. Harold Kessler, sitting in the second row on the groom's side, watched the woman who had once stood over him at 4 a.m. telling him he wasn't allowed to die on her shift, and felt something settle in his chest that he would later describe to his wife as the closest thing to fate I've ever actually witnessed. Diane sat in the front row on the bride's side, alone, in the seat that would ordinarily have been the mother of the bride's seat of honor, watching her older daughter do, without any fanfare, without any expectation of thanks, exactly what she had done for 12 years, show up quietly and hold something together that would otherwise have fallen apart. The reception was, by every account, a genuinely good party. Renee gave a toast she hadn't prepared, 12 sentences long, that made half the room cry, including Harold Kessler, who came up to her afterward and said only, "Thank you for 4 a.m. 2 years ago," and she understood exactly what he meant without needing more explanation than that. But the real conversation, the one that mattered, the one 12 years in the making, happened 3 days later at Renee's kitchen table, the same table where she'd sat with a check in her hand and read a text message that had tried to erase her. Diane came alone without calling first, which for Diane was itself a kind of admission that she no longer had the standing to expect an easy welcome. "I want to understand something," Renee said once her mother was sitting across from her. "Was it that you didn't know how much I'd done, or that you knew and it was easier not to say it out loud?" Diane was quiet for a long time. "Both, I think. At first I didn't really track it. You just handle things and I let myself believe things were handling themselves. And then later when I did understand how much you'd carried, it felt too big to say out loud, because saying it out loud meant admitting I'd failed as a mother in a way I didn't know how to fix. It was easier to keep telling the story where I was managing everything and you were just busy, absent. It made me feel less like I owed you something I couldn't repay. You do owe me something, Renee said. Not money. I never wanted money back and I'm not asking for it now. I want the truth told correctly going forward. I want you to stop letting people believe I'm the distant one. I want, if we're going to keep being a family, for it to be an honest one. I can't keep being the invisible infrastructure everyone stands on and complains isn't around enough. Diane nodded and cried and said she would try, and Renee, who had spent 12 years learning the difference between a promise and an outcome, told her that trying was a start, but she'd be watching for the outcome from here on out. Chloe, no, Renee corrected herself whenever she wrote about it later. It was Paige, always Paige, called every week after that. Not out of guilt, not at first, though there was plenty of guilt in the early calls. Eventually the guilt wore down into something more durable. An actual friendship between sisters who had spent over a decade orbiting each other without ever really landing. Diane sent a letter in December, 8 months after the wedding, typed and then crossed out and rewritten twice, according to what she told Renee later. It didn't ask for anything. It didn't excuse anything. It simply said, in plain, unpolished language, that she saw now what she hadn't let herself see for 12 years, that she was sorry for the specific harm of the guest list and for the general harm of the silence that came before it, and that she hoped, given time, Renee might let her try to be a mother worth the years Renee had spent holding this family up. Renee read it twice. Then she called her mother, not to say everything was fixed because it wasn't and probably wouldn't be for a long time, but to say she'd read it and that it mattered and that she was willing to keep going one honest conversation at a time. She hung up the phone, sat in her kitchen, the same table, and thought about the $4,000 check still sitting in a drawer somewhere, never cashed by Paige, who had insisted on framing it instead, alongside a photo from the wedding. Two sisters walking down an aisle together in a moment nobody had planned, that turned out to be the truest thing that had happened in that family in over a decade. Renee picked up an extra shift on the anniversary of her father's death, the way she had every year for over a decade. Not out of obligation but because the ICU on a quiet night had become, strangely, the place she felt closest to him. He had died in a hospital bed, and something about standing in one, keeping other people's fathers alive, had turned into her private way of grieving him that never required an explanation to anyone else. This year, though, her shift ended at 7, and instead of going home to an empty apartment she drove to her mother's house, where Paige was waiting with a bag of takeout and a bottle of wine, because the three of them had started a new tradition. Dinner together on the date that used to be the hardest day of the year, turned instead into a day they chose to spend on purpose, together, honestly. Diane had gone to therapy twice a month since the letter. She didn't talk about it much, but Renee noticed the difference in small ways. The way her mother had started asking questions instead of narrating conclusions, the way she'd stopped introducing Renee to new acquaintances with the old, careless line about her busy, independent daughter and had started saying instead with something that sounded almost like awe, "This is my daughter Renee, she's the reason any of us are still standing." It wasn't a perfect fix. Renee still caught herself some nights running the old math in her head, the spreadsheet she'd deleted from her laptop the week after the wedding, mostly as a symbolic act, since she remembered most of the numbers anyway and probably always would. Old habits didn't dissolve just because the truth had finally been spoken out loud. But there was a difference now between the 12 years before the wedding and the year after it, and the difference was simple. She was no longer invisible in her own family's account of itself. Paige had asked her a few months back over coffee why she'd never said anything sooner, why she'd let 12 years pass in silence instead of just telling everyone plainly what she was doing and what it was costing her. Renee had thought about it for a while before answering. "I think I was afraid that if I said it out loud it would turn into a transaction. Like I was keeping a ledger and waiting to collect. I didn't want to be that person. I just wanted to help quietly and have it be enough that I knew I'd helped. And now I think silence isn't generosity. I think it's just a different kind of hiding. You can help someone and still tell the truth about what it costs you. Those aren't opposites." She'd shrugged, stirring her coffee. "Took me 12 years and one very awkward wedding morning to learn that." Paige had reached across the table and squeezed her hand, the way she used to when they were kids and their father was still alive and the world still felt uncomplicated. "I'm glad Harold Kessler noticed that seating chart." "Me too," Renee said, and meant it more than she let on. Not because of the wedding, not because of the dramatic unraveling in that little parlor room, but because of the ordinary Tuesday dinners that had followed it, the unremarkable, hard-won, honestly spoken family that had grown slowly out of the wreckage of one very bad morning. She still kept the framed photo Paige had made. The two of them walking down the aisle together, arm in arm, neither of them looking at the camera, both of them looking instead at each other mid-laugh, caught in a moment that no one had planned and everyone in the end would remember. It sat on Renee's kitchen counter now, where the check used to sit, in the exact spot where 1 year ago she had received a text message trying to tell her she wasn't really family. She knew better now. She always had really. It had just taken everyone else a little longer to catch up.